Hey folks, This Week in Law is next. Computer forensics expert Brian Chase is here, as well as lawyer Stefan Schweida. We're going to look at law enforcement access to your devices and data, 3D printing guns, what the kids are up to these days, as well as how they're fact-checking the news they consume and coaching each other at Fortnite. All this and more next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiL.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise Howell, Mike Keys, and Matt Curtis. Episode 428, recorded August 3rd, 2018. Just the fax line, ma'am. Hi, folks, it's Denise Howell, and you're joining us for This Week in Law. Back and better than ever. We've been on a lengthy summer break, but it's August 3rd, and we are back in the saddle. I have literally been in a saddle while we've been off the air, vagabonding around the western United States with family and friends. So had a great break. Missed you all, though. So glad to be back. And we are ready for a great episode of This Week in Law. Of course, there's been just sort of all hell breaking loose while we've been on our summer break. And we're going to try and get through some of that. Of course, it's not possible to get through all of it in this episode, but we will soldier on. We've got a great panel of folks joining us here today. We're very excited to welcome to This Week in Law. Our guest this week, he is Brian Chase. He's a lawyer and computer forensics consultant in Tucson, Arizona. Hi, Brian. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Such a pleasure. Also welcoming back to the show, one of Mike Key's colleagues at Dorsey and Whitney, a return guest on This Week in Law, and fabulous IP litigator Stefan Schweida is here. Hi, Stefan.
Glad to be back. Thanks for having me again.
Great to have you back. Stefan is in Seattle, by the way. We are expecting Matt Curtis to join us. Matt, of course, is busy with a startup. He's relocated himself out to California and is trying to get his online life sciences marketing platform, which is called Pareto, up and running. And so he's a busy guy, but he is going to try and join us for the show. So we'll just kind of add him in as soon as he is able. But in the meantime, we're going to get going, and we're going to start out talking about some stories that have to do with crimes and justice. Brian, before we get into the stories in the rundown, tell us more about what you do as a computer forensics consultant, what that looks like.
Sure. I analyze all sorts of digital evidence, including cell phones, computers, tablets, all the devices that we all have. Also deal with things like emails, Facebook messages, Twitter posts, all that kind of stuff that's gets the label of digital evidence at trial. So my job is to sometimes acquire it, analyze it, figure out where the data is, where it came from, what it means, how it fits into a legal proceeding.
You testify as an expert at trial very often?
I do.
Yeah.
Yep.
So tell us about, without divulging client confidences, obviously, or compromising anything you're working on, can you tell us some specifics about the kinds of cases you work on?
It's pretty wide-ranging. Most of the work is in the criminal law field, as law enforcement is using a lot of digital evidence now. But I also do cases in the civil field, such as trying to figure out if somebody was texting while driving when they got into a car accident, seeing if data was altered during the course of litigation, if somebody changed a document. Sometimes it's intellectual property theft, where people are stealing the IP of a business, and I get called in to see what documents were accessed, how they were moved off the system, were they emailed, those kind of things. So it pretty much covers all range of cases now.
Yeah, I'm sure your life is getting super interesting these days. We don't have any stories in the rundown about smart devices recording people, but is that something that has come across your desk professionally yet?
Professionally, no. There's certainly been stories about it in the last year, 2 years about devices recording, but I haven't seen a case involving that yet.
Not you personally.
Right.
And do you are you primarily hired by criminal defendants?
Yeah, I'm hired by their lawyers generally, so I'll be hired by anytime that digital evidence is being used in a criminal case. I'll get a call from the lawyer, or on the civil side, it could be plaintiffs or defense attorneys, depending on the issues.
Right. Okay, well, you're the perfect person then to discuss a number of the things that have been in the news while we've been on our break. Just this week, let's start with facial recognition and recognition with a K, which is a service that Amazon has been in the news for developing and marketing and selling to various law enforcement agencies. It's in the news this week because the ACLU decided it would try to see what happened if it matched 28 members of Congress using this tool to see if they came up as a match to people in a criminal database. And they did. And they're not real happy about it. Have you looked at recognition specifically and facial recognition in general? And Brian, and can you describe how you think this is going to impact perhaps some of the cases that may come across your desk?
So I haven't seen this used in the wild yet. There's certainly been a lot of articles about it, including the ones this week. And we've had some issues with facial recognition on the new iPhone, the iPhone X, when it uses facial recognition to unlock, but nothing to this extent where pictures are filtered through a database to try to match people to known criminals. Certainly, there's a lot of issues with how this could be used in the wild, how police could use it, because it doesn't seem to be any real oversight as to how this program is used right now. It looks like Amazon has pretty much released it and is letting law enforcement use it. And you could see how the ACLU used it to get false positives from members of Congress.
Right. So maybe we should take a step back and have you describe how it would be used, in what kind of scenario you would see a police officer using this tool. How would that play out?
I think the first thing that jumps to my mind is if they've got something like surveillance video of a crime that occurred, robbery or something like that, and they take the image of the person that did the robbery and then run it through recognition or other facial recognition programs to try to determine who it is that's responsible for that crime that was recorded on video.
Do you think, yes, I could definitely see that kind of scenario playing out. Do you think it's the kind of thing that could play out in real time too, during a stop where police are chatting with someone who may or may not get arrested and they're trying to make up their minds whether the person is likely to have been involved with a crime?
I think so. We've seen in London, for example, they've got the cameras that seem to be doing real-time facial recognition, and China certainly has that as well. I could easily see the U.S. moving in that direction. It could be done maybe from the officer's body cam directly if the body cam is ever hooked up to an internet connection, but also just in a typical traffic stop, they ask for your ID. They could just go back to their cruiser, scan the ID, and try to match the picture up with any suspects that they're looking for in related crimes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. All right, so one of the important points in this ACLU demonstration is the confidence level that the tool, this recognition, and why Amazon decided to spell it with a K, I will never know. It makes it sound far more sinister to me to spell it with a K. Setting all that aside, the documentation that goes along with it makes various recommendations, and Amazon has been quick to come out and say that if you are trying to have great certainty in your match, you should set your quote unquote confidence level in using the tool very high to 99%. But that's not what the ACLU did. They used 80 or 85% confidence level, which is what Amazon itself does when it demos the product. So there seems to be some fuzziness around the parameters that are used in making a match. I assume that's something that you could have a lot to say about at trial if your defendant, for example, was identified using a tool like this.
Yeah, the confidence level, I think, is one of the most concerning parts of the story. It looks like it looks like the program ships with a default confidence level of that 80% or 85%. So then Amazon is asking law enforcement to change it to 99%. And, people never change the defaults. They remain where they are. And this could certainly lead to false arrests and people being taken to jail who are actually innocent. You can imagine if a law enforcement did have this program set up at a confidence level of 80% like the ACLU, and they stopped one of these members of Congress, they might be arresting the member of Congress if there was a warrant out for that person or something like that. They might think the ID is false. It could lead to a lot of poor outcomes. I think a lot of it would get resolved fairly quickly because hopefully at least there's going to be a human behind the system that's going to verify things and say that yes or no, that is the person we're looking for. But it could lead to somebody getting arrested, and arrest alone can be pretty damning to a lot of people. It can cost a job, they could be thrown in jail, they might have to hire lawyers and spend a lot of money. So even just that potential of a false arrest is pretty scary in a situation like this. So that confidence level, I think that's the key part of this story, is it really needs to be set high. And I think law enforcement really needs to be trained about how this tool works, and policies need to be put in place to make sure that the tool is not abused or doesn't lead to false arrests.
So the congresspeople who were misidentified or matched to criminal mugshots obviously aren't happy about this. Various other congresspeople are not happy about this. And they have written some pointed letters and want information about how the tool works. What's your over-under on whether Congress will take any action to regulate these kinds of tools?
I would be surprised if they took any action. I think the only reason they're getting involved right now is because they personally were falsely identified in the system. But I don't think anything really is going to come of it. I think it'll end up playing out in the criminal justice system as this technology gets used and people are arrested and defense attorneys start challenging the system. But I have very little faith that U.S. Congress or even state legislators are going to take up this issue and regulate the system and how police use it.
All right. Well, we have a related story. At least I consider it a related story, and sort of a throwback in internet history all at the same time. You guys remember Real Networks and Rob Glazer, its founder. They became famous in the 90s, and anyone who was using a computer in the 90s knows exactly who Real Networks is, because they were the go-to media player at the time. They were a pioneer in streaming media. They did not last long as technology changed. They acquired Rhapsody and then spun it off. They more recently acquired something called Slingo, and they have a mobile phone app called Listen that plays custom ringtones. So it seems like in recent years they've been struggling to find a business model that was as successful as the Real Player was for them back in the day. And one direction they seem to be going is to address this problem of safety in schools. And Rob Glazer thinks that using facial recognition could be the answer. I suppose the goal here is to screen people who are on campus. And if there is someone, if the facial recognition tool doesn't match to a database of people who are authorized to be on campus, then steps are taken to remove them. So Real Networks is launching something called SAFR, SAFR, for free, that can be integrated into school camera systems. They say their recognition accuracy is 99.8%, based on a test created by the University of Massachusetts that vets facial recognition systems. But of course, they acknowledge that their tool, like many other facial recognition tools, has issues in the accuracy goes down when they're asked to recognize Black or brown faces, et cetera. So it's definitely, and that 99.8% number has to take that into account. And so Real Networks doesn't have the software predict ethnicity the way it predicts age and gender, for fear that it could be misused in that way. So how do we feel about, against the backdrop of the discussion of the Amazon tool having accuracy issues, how do we feel about these things being used in school? Stefan, what do you think?
Well, it seems to me that the motivation that Mr. Glazer expressed in the article anyway was that he wanted to come up with this tool because he didn't feel like he could address the real issue here, which was gun safety in schools. And he thought that was too explosive and too polarizing. And so rather than address the issue head on, he's come up with this sort of backdoor to try to make schools more safe through technology. And I think when you look at it in that context, it's unfortunate that we can't address what the core issue here is and the things that are making people feel unsafe. Using facial recognition as a means of making sure that the people at schools are the people who are supposed to be there doesn't seem all that different from having a list of names and checking it off when people arrive or doing an attendance list. It's just a more efficient way of doing that. So I think it kind of depends on if you're looking at this as a substitute for improving school safety. I'm not sure that it's going to do the job. If you're looking at it as a way of more efficiently ensuring that the right people are at the school and the wrong people are not, it just seems like a incremental step forward in that regard. So my answer is it depends on how you see this and why you're looking at it. I think on its own, it's kind of a neutral technology, but if you load it up with the context of this is supposed to make schools safer, I'm not sure that we get there in this indirect way.
Right. As someone who looks at things through the lens of criminal justice, Brian, do you see any red flags in this?
I think the red flags with all the facial recognition software out there is its lack of ability to identify minority individuals. It's this article talked about how it can't handle, at least doesn't do well with black skin or brown skin. Same thing with Amazon's recognition. So it's going to lead to a lot more false positives for minorities. And I tend to agree. I don't see how this really makes schools that much safer. If you're trying to combat gun violence in schools, I wonder how many school shootings were carried out by students who were otherwise allowed to be on campus, and how this, technology would have made any difference in that regard. Certainly, from memory, it seems like a lot of the school shootings are carried out by students at the school. So this wouldn't really have stopped anybody from coming in. I think you're better off with more physical security, a front desk where people check in before coming into the school, and you're going to get a much higher accuracy if you've got a person sitting at a front desk checking IDs for people coming into the school, other than that of the students coming in.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I did have something I wanted to add there, and it flew right out of my head. That's what a lengthy vacation will do for you. But if it comes back to me, I'll let you know. So we've got Real Network's facial recognition tool being offered for free to schools, trying to address a gun violence issue. So since we're talking about gun violence and the proliferation of it, let's talk about 3D printed guns, shall we? Another big story in the news this week. And we've discussed this before on This Week in Law because this site, DefCAD, has been around for a while. And just recently this week, it was getting ready to go live and did go live for a bit and upload a number of CAD files to 3D print guns at home or wherever you might do your 3D printing. And it was blocked by a federal judge. There's an injunction that prevented it from fully implementing what it planned to. However, several of their files had already been released for 10 different firearms. Those files have already been downloaded thousands of times. The folks at Ars Technica downloaded 4 of the files, including designs for an AR-15 rifle. That's what I wanted to mention a moment ago, too, is just to mention that when we were looking into SAFER, the story that we were looking at was from Wired Magazine, and it was Issy Lepowski's, and that you can review everything that we've reviewed to get ready for the show today. If you head on over to tagpacker.com/user/thisweekinlaw, we are doing episode 428 today. So all our stories, discussion points are there too. We also do a Flipboard magazine that's a little less well organized. You're not going to be able to see it by episode, but if you go on over to our Flipboard magazine, the most current stuff relates to the most recent episode. So as we're now looking at an Ars Technica piece on 3D printed guns, let's go further with that and point out that there are 8 states that are involved in trying to block this. Several other states have sent a letter expressing their support, but they're not actively involved in the litigation. The state of Washington is leading that charge and attempting to keep DefCAD from making these files more widely available than they already are. The main issue here seems to me that what a court is ultimately going to have to decide is whether a couple of things, whether it makes a difference that plans for making a firearm on your own are available in this format, because they've been available in other formats for a very long time. There are laws that say that have been on the books forever that say you can make guns at home. Does it make a difference that they're 3D printed and distributed over the internet? So that's one point that is ultimately going to have to get hashed out here. The other more nuanced point is there is a law on the books that says you cannot have a weapon, whether you've made it at home or otherwise, that is all plastic and can therefore evade metal detectors. And folks tend to get around that by adding a plastic clip that is there and then can be removed and then reattached to show that you're in compliance with the law, that you could readily take it through a metal detector and it would not have any metal in it when you did. So that's something else that I think will get hashed out in this, whether the 3D printed guns are going to are running afoul of any of our laws, or whether Congress will come in and say, now that we recognize that there's this loophole, we're going to require that any gun made in any fashion has metal parts that could be detected in a metal detector or X-ray machine. So let's start with you, Brian. What do you think of these developments?
There's a lot of issues here to unpack. We've got the fact that these are kind of already illegal to own a plastic firearm, but there is that kind of exception to add just a single piece of metal to it, which, I mean, the concern there is getting these things past security, getting them past metal detectors. There's also plenty of laws in place to regulate people who are not allowed to own firearms at all, because there's some concern that somebody who is what's called a prohibited possessor, not allowed to own a firearm, could just go online and print a gun. Even if it was legal to do that, to go online and print a plastic gun, it would still be illegal for that person to own a gun. I'm kind of questioning, how is this different in some respects to just going to, say, a gun show and buying a gun compared to printing it yourself? There's very little restrictions on both. Although right now the technology to print guns is quite expensive. But I think the concern is coming that it's getting cheaper and cheaper to do 3D printing. It'll be easier for people to print these guns and then get them past security. I think it's going to be a tough issue to regulate because trying to shut down anything on the internet is always difficult. People will find a way around it. I don't really know how this will play out. I think it's going to be a tough issue and tough to detect these things once they become easier to produce, to print, to own.
Do you think the solution is what some Congress people are proposing, that we should have a law that guns have to be made out of, some core piece of the gun has to be made out of metal, so it can't just be clipped on and then removed?
I think that addresses the biggest issue in the story is getting these past metal detectors. So if you have a law like that where a large part of the gun has to be metal, that alleviates that concern. Of course, if you could still 3D print it, I don't see what's stopping somebody from taking a model that's got one piece that's supposed to be metal and then just 3D printing that piece in plastic, until somebody's caught with a plastic firearm, which is currently still mostly illegal. There's not a whole lot you can do to kind of prevent people from doing this.
Right, and I guess it doesn't address, I mean, certainly having legislation like that would be helpful, but it doesn't address the fact that there aren't metal detectors and x-ray machines everywhere, and this would lead to a proliferation of weapons, possibly in the hands of people who aren't supposed to have them, enabling them to take possession of something that maybe they couldn't go out and buy. Maybe they could buy it at a gun show, since the rules about acquisition there are more of a free-for-all. What do you think about all this, Stefan?
I think a little bit like with the facial recognition discussion we had in the school context, that the thrust of the discussion is driven by an inability to engage directly with the question. And I think there are taboos around gun control in this country that are very strong, and I think it's a lot easier for the public and for Congress to engage in this sort of corner case debate about 3D printed guns than it is to directly tackle the question of gun regulation. And I think the reason I'm describing this as a bit of a corner case is a lot of commentators have pointed out that the actual issue at stake here has a pretty limited shelf life. The technology behind 3D printing is going to change. Those CAD diagrams have already been widely distributed, and there's nothing stopping from the people who already have them from distributing them further. The regulatory framework that is being used to stop the 3D printing at this point is a little bit Byzantine. I mean, if you look at the underlying statutes, they involve international export regulations, and there are exemptions made for documents that are in the public domain. So, for instance, it's teaching people how to make guns is not illegal, and if you look at putting a 3D a CAD diagram for 3D printing on the internet, whether that constitutes an export that can be properly regulated by the president, which is what the statutory framework here implies, it's an open question. And I think give it 6 months, a year, and the technology is going to evolve, and this particular controversy is going to go away. What's going to be left is an unanswered question about, should people be printing and distributing homemade guns on a large scale? And I don't think any of the legal controversies that the courts are ruling on right now actually directly address that question. They're kind of dealing with the margins of the question. And as long as that's true, this issue is not going to be resolved. It's going to come up in a new form every time somebody modifies the underlying technology in some way.
There's a quote in one of the pieces in our rundown from a gun rights group person in Ohio who made the point that you may be able to watch a video of someone doing surgery on YouTube, but if you really care about doing the surgery right and the person being subjected to the surgery, the fact that you've watched it in detail doesn't mean that you're going to go out and try it yourself. And so I think his point is that, you know, that the ability to make a gun in your home as a hobbyist is I think the same person made the point that, you know, people, for the same reason they build car engines, it's interesting to see how the machinery works and tinker around with it and understand the device more fully. So the reason I bring all that up is because tinkering around with parts and you know, following instructions that you found in various places is a little bit different than downloading a CAD file where someone has tested and maybe not made any representations or warranties. I don't think they're that stupid, but at least you have some sense that if you download this file and send it to a 3D printer, you're going to get something more reliable than what you would be able to have faith in by watching a video of doing surgery on the internet. Does that change things? Does this idea of the digital file and enhanced reliability and enhanced availability make a difference here? What do you think, Stefan?
So to be clear, I certainly see this as a problem and sort of a frightening problem to imagine people printing workable guns in their homes. I think my point is really that the way that this is being litigated right now doesn't seem to address that problem directly. And because it's this indirect approach where you're going after a specific set of CAD diagrams under legislation that involves international trade and sort of the Administrative Procedures Act, you're not really engaging the issue, or not you. I mean the courts and Congress are not directly addressing the issue at hand, and I think I think they feel inhibited by how polarizing the underlying topic is, and so I see that as unfortunate. So of course, the idea that you could print a usable, untraceable firearm with CAD diagrams that are being distributed on the internet, that's terrifying, frankly. But what I find even more concerning is that there's not really an attempt to address the underlying problem. It's all this sort of on the margins, indirect, very temporary and fleeting discussion about, you know, how do we stop this one person from doing this one thing, where I think the problem actually is much deeper and broader than this particular line of cases acknowledges.
Yeah, I get your point. It's like getting Al Capone for tax fraud.
Right. Yeah. It's very similar. Yeah.
Exactly. What do you think, Brian?
I tend to agree. I think it's kind of I would not compare it to the learning how to do surgery at home. There's a big difference between downloading a CAD file and sending it to a printer than there is to watching a video about how to do something. I don't really buy the free speech argument that the creators of these CAD files are making, that this is just teaching people how to make a gun, because it's not really anything about it that's teaching. You're downloading a file, you're sending it to a printer. I think that's more analogous to, you know, downloading a PDF and printing it. There's nothing there to teach you about the making of a gun. But I don't think this battle is going to do much. I think it's a really difficult issue to legislate. I also think it's not much of a concern at the moment. I don't think we're going to see people out there printing guns right now. It's just very, very expensive to do. If somebody wanted a gun, there are much cheaper ways to get a gun that would be far more reliable than a plastic gun. It wouldn't risk, you know, blowing up when you fire it. So at the moment, I think there's a lot more hype than we need to be worried about. But I think, a few years from now, as the printers get better and cheaper, it's going to become more of an issue for us trying to regulate these things and keep things safe. Otherwise, I don't see a way to prevent people from doing this and getting these guns past security.
Yeah, Virgil in IRC spitballs an idea that it's worth mentioning. He says, couldn't the 3D printing material be required to have metal particles in it? I don't know how you would be able to control that every single bit of 3D printing material available would have metal particles in it. that would be a toughie to enforce, I would think. And certainly if you're in a frame of mind where you're going to print a plastic gun, you're probably, and you've downloaded the files and you're about to go about it, you're probably not going to be real conscientious about, I guess I should use material that has metal particles in it because otherwise it would be illegal. I don't see that necessarily as being a solution. Any thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, I wonder if instead of the files being regulated, if the printers themselves could be regulated, if there's some way to have the printer basically refuse to print one of these files. I see in forensics field what we have are known files out there that are illegal, and they create a hash value of those, and there are companies that are scanning for those hashes. So that if they see one of those files, they immediately notify law enforcement. I'm wondering if you could do the same kind of thing with the CAD files, where you get hashes of the known files, and the printers are told not to print those files. There's certainly a lot of ways around that already, and certainly in all you have to do is change a small amount, and it will change the hash. But I'm wondering if that's maybe one way to try to address this issue.
Right. Well, okay, let us move on to something else that you work on, Brian, which has to do with accessing information on devices and sort of the cat and mouse that goes on about law enforcement, not just asking for evidence from a suspect or a suspect's device, but also from a third-party tech company who may be the repository of that information. There was a study done recently by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They released a report saying that only 20% of requests from law enforcement to such companies are denied. What's your anecdotal or observational experience in the industry, Brian?
Well, generally, if the request is denied, I never see it. It never gets to me.
Yeah.
But I do get a lot of cases that involve requests made to various tech companies for information. Oftentimes, it's to internet service providers to try to track down an individual, say who is the owner of an IP address at a given time. Frequent requests to Facebook and to Google for data. It's pretty common. In fact, it's so common that most of these tech companies set up dedicated law enforcement fax lines so that law enforcement can get their subpoena or their warrant and fax it directly to the company.
Wait.
And they have a team there receiving those faxes kind of all day long.
Hold on, I just have to back up for a second and marvel at the fact that we're talking about highly sophisticated, often encrypted digital technologies here, and the cat and mouse about getting access to them, and they have dedicated fax lines?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the law is often well behind the times, so they're still using faxes. There are some companies that have email addresses now. They got a little more sophisticated. But if you look at a lot of the internet service providers, for example, that's where I see it most often, is they have a fax line. There's various websites out there that actually track the contact information for law enforcement for these tech companies, so that law enforcement can basically say, I need to get data from Verizon. How do I get a hold of them? And they go to a website and it has all their legal contact information and typically a fax.
Oh my goodness gracious. Okay, so this doesn't surprise any of us. I presume that many of these requests are granted. Most terms of service or company policies by service providers, if you read through them, will tell you that if the company is presented with a legitimate request from law enforcement for information, they are either feel compelled or will turn over that information. And many of them deal with that tension that no doubt comes from their users about how their data may or may not be turned over by publishing transparency reports and letting the public at large know how many requests they get and how many of those requests are complied with. Stefan, anything to add here?
I was shocked by the compliance numbers. Actually, I thought it was a pretty high percentage, and really what I have is a question, I think, for Brian, and it's, when these requests are made, who's the requester and who's receiving the request, and what's the discretion that the companies have? I mean, what's sort of the point of contact? Can they say, I'm not going to do this, come after me with this, with a warrant or something, or what's the actual what's the actual pipeline from the request to the granting of the request look like, and what are the points of discretion that individuals have in those moments? Do you know?
It varies a lot on how that request is made and what legal authority they use for the request. There's lots of laws out there that allow for subpoenas to these companies. I've seen, I don't know how many different subpoenas made under different federal and state statutes. And under the subpoenas, some companies will fight them. I've seen Facebook and Google both send notices to their users that they've received a subpoena for their data, and that they have usually about 7 days to file an objection with the court. And if they don't file an objection with the court, then the company will produce the information. Sometimes law enforcement goes the warrant route. I haven't seen any company fight a warrant for these yet, but subpoenas seem to be the most popular way to go because they're a lot easier to get. And I haven't seen companies fight them very often. When they do fight them, we do see them in the news. We saw Amazon last year, I think it was last year, fighting the request for data from an Amazon Echo after a murder took place in a home. There's been Apple fought the request for the San Bernardino case. So you see them occasionally, but most often I just see the companies say you have 7 days to make an objection, and if you don't, we're going to turn over the data to law enforcement.
And we should discuss, for people who are not lawyers and don't really get what all these procedural niceties are, the difference between a subpoena and a warrant. A warrant is something that has to be issued by a judge, that is something only law enforcement would use. But a subpoena, I can issue a subpoena sitting here right now. I'm a lawyer. I could issue a civil subpoena. I have to comply with my legal ethics. It has to relate to something I'm working on and information that we need in connection with the dispute. But any lawyer can issue a subpoena, right, Brian?
Yep. There's a lot of ways for lawyers to issue the subpoenas. There's also many more ways for law enforcement to get the subpoena. They could take it to a grand jury, for example, and have a grand jury issue the subpoena. They could use one of the many statutes that authorize them to get a subpoena, and there's no judicial oversight in that. And often there's no oversight from prosecutors in the process. The law enforcement pretty much just sends the subpoena with nothing prohibiting them from doing so. And then it's left for the defense to challenge the subpoena later in the case.
Do you feel like these companies have a different pipeline for requests that come from law enforcement than from an attorney who may be on the other side of a case or working in a civil case?
They absolutely do. Facebook, for example, has, at least in the past, required lawyers to get the subpoena and then domesticate it in California, meaning if a lawyer was in another state other than California, that state issues the subpoena, then the lawyer has to take it to a California court to get the subpoena domesticated in California, and then Facebook will accept it and then you usually get a call from Facebook's legal team to discuss the subpoena before they'll produce any information. From what I've heard from other lawyers who have done it, it's taken a long time to get data through a civil subpoena process, whereas law enforcement generally gets it very quickly.
Is that domestication process a little bit like having a court vet it the way they would a warrant? Or is it sort of more of a rubber stamp procedural, you take it to court and the clerk signs off on it?
I personally haven't had to do it yet, but from at least anecdotally what I've heard from other lawyers is that it's not hard to get it domesticated. It's pretty much rubber stamp, but it is added steps that you have to go through, and then you have to send it to Facebook, and then you usually have some more hurdles once you get to Facebook and their legal team.
All right, well, this is a good segue in IRC to our next topic. Virgil just typed in there, FBI boss, we went to the moon, so why can't we have crypto backdoors? From an article in the Register. What's the latest on the back and forth between law enforcement and the rest of us in trying to mandate tech companies have backdoors into the devices that we use, Brian?
It's been a continual cat and mouse game outside of legislation of forensic software providers trying to find ways into devices, try to get past encryption, and then the device manufacturers changing things and shutting down the methods used by the forensic software providers. The issue with legislation or any sort of backdoor is that, if the government can get into it, what's to prevent a hacker from using that same method to get into it? What happens if the keys that are provided to the government leak? We've seen plenty of government leaks. It's anytime you've got any type of backdoor, you can't expect that to stay quiet for a long period of time, and it weakens security for everybody.
It does. So what's going on with Apple on that front these days? Do you know?
So Apple has been kind of the forefront of fighting against the abilities to get into their iPhones. For a while, there was forensic methods to bypass the PIN or password locks on iOS. Then Apple changes the way that works, and then those methods don't work anymore. There's a company called Celebrite that is typically in the news when it comes to these, and they've been at the forefront of trying to bypass Apple's encryption and Apple's passwords or PIN locks. Most recently, this past spring, a new company came into the fold called Grayshift, and they make a product called Gray Key. It's been in the news a lot lately because what Gray Key did was allow law enforcement to plug an iPhone into this black box. I mean, it's literally just a black box. And then after a period of time, Gray Key would find the password to the phone and unlock the phone, allowing law enforcement access to the data inside the phone. After that happened, Apple then updated in version, I think it was 11.4 of iOS. They made it more difficult to access the data in that way. They introduced a thing called USB restricted mode. What that does is if the password has not been entered on the device for 1 hour, no data can transfer through the Lightning port. And that's how these phones connect to either Celebrite or Grayshift, is through that Lightning port. So if the password hasn't been entered, that port is shut down and no data can be sent to the phone or received from the phone using the Lightning port. And that essentially shut down all methods of getting access to the device. After they did that, it looked like Gray Key was going to be able to bypass it and then Gray Key and keep working. Then there was another update to iOS. And as it stands right now, it appears that Gray Key cannot access the device, but Gray Key has been very quiet about how their product works and how they're getting through Apple's encryption in order to get to the device. Gray Key only sells their product to law enforcement. The device costs, they have two options. One is a $15,000 device, which has to stay on site at the law enforcement office wherever they're doing their forensic work. and has a limit to how many phones they can unlock. And then there's a more expensive version that's $30,000 that is more mobile and does not have a limit to unlock the device. But currently, it looks like GrayKey is not able to bypass the latest version of iOS. But I'd say give it some time, and I suspect they'll find a way around it, and then Apple will patch that, and the cycle will continue.
Is there a forensics defense that a defendant could put forward if the evidence was attained against them using one of these devices? Not so much a constitutional defense, which we've seen discussed and have discussed on the show, but something that questions the reliability of the tools being used to access these devices. Is that a possibility?
I think it is. There's been all this evidence is subject to what's called the Daubert rule. It's a rule that's about expert witness testimony and the reliability of the methodology used by forensic examiners, and that's not just limited to digital forensics. The rule's been around a lot longer than that. Any kind of forensic science is subject to this rule. And with GrayKey in particular, I think it's going to be difficult for law enforcement to talk about how the data they obtained was not altered in any way, was handled in a forensically sound method, because no one knows how this box works.
It's literally a black box.
It is. It's literally a black box, and there's just no way of saying what was done to the phone in order to get the data. So I think there's going to be some difficulty in it. But GrayKey is so new. Just starting up in the spring, I haven't seen any case have that issue litigated yet. I think give it a few more months and those cases will start weeding through the court system. But it's going to depend on a defense team to challenge that and force law enforcement to explain that no data was altered during the process. And I don't know how they're going to do that.
Right. You'd have to, I suppose, subpoena GrayKey and put them on the stand to testify that they're not altering data, and then the trier of fact would have to decide whether they believe them.
Yeah, I think it's going to be similar to how some of the Stingray legislation or Stingray cases played out. The Stingray was a device, still is a device used by law enforcement to track cell phone location. It acts as a cell tower, and the phones connect to it. So they can put that in front of a building, for example, and see what phones are inside the building. A few years ago, these cases started hitting the courts, and the companies that produce these Stingray devices had NDAs with the federal government and made local law enforcement sign NDAs as well. Once the defense started challenging the Stingray device, a lot of those cases ended up being dismissed because courts ordered that they had to turn over how the device worked and how it was being used. And instead of turning over that information, prosecutors ended up just dismissing the case to keep quiet how the Stingray worked. And I think that may turn out to be the same way with GrayKey if judges start ordering that either somebody from GrayKey testify as to how it works, or that the local law enforcement have to testify as to the methodology used by GrayKey.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating to see how it plays out. And folks like you will be at ground zero of those developments. We need to put our first MCLE passphrase into the show. We put these phrases into the show in case you are a lawyer who likes to, or another professional who likes to listen to our show for professional credit in your field. If you are a lawyer in the United States, we have a wiki that should give you a little bit of help with that process. It is at wiki.twit.tv. Find our This Week in Law show page there, and we've got a 50-state chart that at least tries to give you some documentation and stuff, how you might apply to get MCLE credit in your jurisdiction, or if your jurisdiction even makes that a possibility for you. So we put these phrases in because in many instances, your oversight body may need to see that you actually watched or listened to the show. Our first phrase is going to be throwing the oven out with the pizza. And that comes from a quote related to one of the earlier stories we discussed. Amazon, in talking about its facial recognition software, one of its folks in machine learning and AI said that while being concerned it's applied correctly, we should not throw away the oven because the temperature could be set wrong and burn the pizza. He's referring to the default we were talking about, and how you would want to perhaps boost the default confidence from 80 or 85% up to 99% if you were very interested in the accuracy of the results. So our first phrase, throwing the oven out with the pizza, comes from that. And we will put another one in before the show is over. But for now, we're going to move on to some stories that have to do with the social web. This one could very well have been our tip of the week this week, but so you can treat it as such if you'd like. But I guess in tip form, it would go something like, if you are traveling to Egypt, do not complain about your experiences there on social media in any way, shape, or form, because, and this is not the first instance of the current regime in Egypt having a very crackdown mentality about the internet and its uses. A woman from Lebanon named Mona El Mazbou, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She was 24 years old. She was doing vacation tourism in Egypt and didn't have a very good time. And she posted a video where she complained a lot about the country. She complained she was subjected to sexual harassment. She complained about various aspects of the country. She did post an apology for all of this, but that did not prevent government officials from arresting her at Cairo's airport and ultimately, through their legal process, finding her guilty of deliberately spreading false rumors that would harm society, of attacking religion, and of public indecency. She has been sentenced to 8 years in prison. If you're planning your camel and pyramid trip, just be well aware. And a terrible thing that has happened to this 24-year-old woman on vacation. Any thoughts, Stefan?
I thought it was interesting in the article. There was a reference made to the fact that people have always complained about vacations and always had, told their friends about some bad experience they had, and that doing so on a platform like the one she complained on shouldn't change the underlying fact of this is just somebody complaining about their vacation. And first of all, let me be perfectly clear here. I'm not endorsing the arrest of this woman in any way, shape, or form, but I will say that that's a slightly naive view because what the context in which you use technology matters as much as the technology itself. And in this case, a platform that might have a very different impact if it were used in the US or Canada or Europe. If you're in a country as unstable as Egypt is right now, that same platform is going to have a very different impact. And I think to pretend that this is no different than somebody complaining about their vacation, it strikes me as a little bit naive or disingenuous because you have to take the context in which you use technology into account when you're evaluating its impact. And so I thought that was a weird framing in the story about what this woman had done. I think it's a little dismissive of the underlying issue, I think.
Yeah, I agree. But it does, by the same token, I think it behooves people wherever they're traveling to consider, whether their usual social media practices make sense in the context of where they are and what they're doing. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Brian?
It's a pretty horrifying result, after posting a video online to then be sentenced to prison. Certainly she would have had no idea that was a potential outcome of what she did, especially considering that it wasn't like it was in her control to make that video go viral. And I don't think that was probably her intention. I can't imagine posting something online, it getting a lot of attention and being arrested for it when it's just kind of airing grievances. I think it's should make us think that, even if we post something, here in the United States about a country like Egypt, would we get, arrested if we then travel to that country for a vacation or for business or for whatever reason? Do we need to be considering everything we post now on social media and what effects it might have if we were to leave the country and go to some other country?
Yeah, absolutely. The EFF highlighted this story. They also weighed in and continue periodically to weigh in on the issue we were just discussing a moment ago. This whole notion of we can send people to the moon. Why can't we have crypto backdoors? They have a recent piece on that, and they've always spoken with one voice on this point that echoes what Brian was saying earlier. That once you break the encryption, it's broken. It doesn't matter. You can't just break it for one law enforcement oriented group and expect the platform to be secure at all. I should ask you, Stefan, if you have any further thoughts on that as well before we move on.
I think the people working on these problems have a very difficult job, and I think I trust I trust them to do their jobs carefully, and I hope that they continue to weigh these factors, because I think anybody pretending that this is an easy answer, and there's one easy approach, I just think there isn't, and I hope we continue to have a public, open debate about where the policy should be, and I hope that everybody treats it seriously. Everybody who has an ability to impact it treats it seriously, because I don't think any one person can sit down and say that there's an easy result here. And
no.
I've been heartened by the sophistication of the debate, and I hope it stays that way.
Yeah, witness the fact that we've been discussing this issue on this show for at least, I don't know, I want to say 4 years now, maybe longer than that. So it is one that has not gone away and continues to be important and deserve everybody's best thoughts and analyses and efforts. Let us move on. This of course, was just in the news this week, just sort of an update on the manipulation of social media platforms by folks interested in either causing chaos or just unrest or instability, whether it's Russia or now it's harder to tell from a forensics perspective who exactly is engaging in inauthentic activity on the platform. Facebook this week came out with a blog post that discussed that it had suspended 32 accounts that it suspected of or had concluded were engaging in inauthentic activity, particularly in connection with an event that was about to happen. Facebook wanted to let the public and other organizers of the event know that at least some of the people involved in putting the event together, it was a protest, had ulterior motives. They were not legitimate accounts, and people should, act accordingly and judge the information accordingly. So Facebook in the past has identified this Internet Research Agency as an arm of the Russian government that has been acting on the site and attempting to influence public opinion. But now Facebook, in quite a transparent, this is what's happening and this is what we're doing about it kind of post, pointed out, as did Mark Zuckerberg personally, that security is not something that is a static thing. That's something you're constantly working to achieve. The quote that caught my eye from the blog post is, "The cat and mouse game of catching inauthentic activity is only heating up. This set of actors has better operational security and does more to conceal its identity than the IRA did around the 2016 election, which is to be expected. After we named the IRA, we expected the organization to evolve. The set of actors we see now might be the IRA with improved capabilities, or it could be a separate group. This is one of the fundamental limitations of attribution. Offensive organizations improve their techniques once they have been uncovered, and it is wishful thinking to believe that we will always be able to identify persistent actors with high confidence. So forensically, Brian, what do you think platforms can do about any of this other than just continue to monitor and suspend accounts as they can?
I think it's a really tough technical problem for Facebook or other platforms. Things in the past were a lot easier. You'd look to see if there was an IP address coming from Russia and give you a good idea of what's going on. But with the use of VPNs and the ability for people to kind of hide their identity, it's getting harder and harder. I think one of these articles, Facebook talked about how they were able to track some of this because one of the administrators of one of these groups was administrator for something like 7 minutes. And during that 7 minutes, they had an IP address that was associated with the IRA. But if not for that, basically tiny mistake that this individual from the IRA made, it would have been a lot harder for Facebook to track down this activity. They're certainly taking a lot of steps. They hired, I think they have a team of 200 people just working on counterterrorism. Mark Zuckerberg talked a lot about this. He did an interview, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, with Kara Swisher on Recode, and he talked in detail about what Facebook is doing to try to combat what's going on. But I think it's going to be an uphill battle for them trying to eliminate or try to minimize these fake accounts or these IRA-based accounts that are trying to spread misinformation online.
Is there anything more you think, not just that the platforms themselves should be doing, but that lawmakers in the United States should be doing to address this? Or are they so removed from the equation that they can't effectively legislate or regulate this issue?
I don't know what Congress would do to try to regulate this. They could certainly impose more regulation on Facebook. But my concern anytime Congress acts in the internet space is that there's going to be repercussions that are felt by the average American that hurt the platform or hurt our access to it. I think there are certainly things that they could require of Facebook, which Facebook has done kind of on their own, such as labeling political advertising as political advertising. But I think it's a tough issue to regulate. And I think anytime that they want to regulate in this field, they really need to be careful about the unintended consequences of such regulation.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. We are seeing, though, elsewhere in the Facebook universe, over on Instagram, this was a really interesting piece that caught my eye about if you can't deal with this very effectively forensically, and it's getting harder and harder to identify inauthentic accounts that are designed just to manipulate public opinion, at least there's a healthy degree of skepticism and discussion among young people, it seems. There's a piece over at The Atlantic by Taylor Lawrence called Teens Are Debating the News on Instagram, and it's about something called flop accounts, which I hadn't heard of before. These are pages that are managed by several teens collectively. They discuss all kinds of really incendiary kinds of topics, gun control, LGBTQ issues, et cetera, et cetera. Or they, some of them discuss like somebody's favorite TV show, or, there are, I guess, various species of flop accounts. But the thing that they have in common is the reason they're called flop accounts is something will get posted that someone considers controversial or essentially a fail. And then a discussion ensues among people of various views. And it reminds me of, sort of the early days of blogging when part of the community ethos was to fact check your A word. And, just a discussion where there was a lot of skepticism and trying to get down to the actual source of, what this information is. Is it real? And it seems like what the teens are doing in the discussions around these flop accounts is identifying something that could have been posted by an inauthentic account, or really trying to get to the bottom of something and doing their own forms of citizen journalism so that they could come up with their own opinions on things. So it's not a forensic solution. It's more a social solution, attempting to contend with this notion that the information that you might find on the internet is something that should perhaps be viewed with skepticism and rigor. What do you think of this, Brian?
I thought it was pretty interesting. I had never heard of these flop accounts before. I certainly have mixed feelings about it. In some respects, it seems a lot of these teens are on here because they don't trust kind of mainstream media. And I think as a whole, not trusting mainstream media at all could lead to some problems down the road. It also leads me to believe what sources are they relying on if they're fact checking. On the flip side of it too is what's to prevent somebody running one of these flop accounts who is a Russian actor or somebody who just wants to spread misinformation or wants to kind of troll individuals involved in the discussion. I don't think this really gets around some of the issues we see on Facebook. I think it's just a platform that hasn't yet been targeted for a disinformation campaign, or if it has been, we haven't seen it yet. It's just very interesting how these discussions kind of unfolded and how these groups are forming.
You're absolutely right, and that was one of the first thoughts I had too. Is of course these can be gamed as well, but so can Wikipedia, and still we seem to be able to get fairly accurate information from that sort of crowdsourcing process, and I feel like there's kind of a parallel here too, and it's sort of interesting to see younger people responding to, I think, what they consider a problem and a threat by trying to solve it themselves. And so, yes, and your point about having skepticism of the media too is rather chilling. But apparently, I wonder, as the parent of a teenager, I wonder if they have skepticism of the media, or they just have an inflated sense of their own self-importance and validity. But that's just probably because I'm in the trenches on those issues day in and day out. So I just thought it was a fascinating development. What else do we have to discuss under this particular topic? I think that's about it for our social web stories. I was hoping that we would have Matt Curtis with us. He has not surfaced yet, but let's just quickly discuss this patent story before we move on, if we could. The reason that I was hoping to have Matt on is, number one, he is definitely a more of a patent aficionado than I am, but also because we've ribbed him in the past about his skepticism about whether things should be put on the blockchain, and this seems to be something that he'll enjoy, hopefully after the fact. And what we wanted to point out is that as more and more things are incorporating blockchain, being put on the blockchain, developing various different blockchain technologies, it should come as no surprise that patent applications are being filed around it. And over at Legal Tech News is a discussion about patenting your blockchain. Some 50 blockchain-related patents have issued in just the first half of this year. So just something to consider as blockchain technologies and ICOs and crypto funds proliferate, is that, of course, you're going to have a proliferation of patents around all that as well. Any thoughts about what we might see there, Stefan?
Yeah, it's an interesting area, because on in the first order you have the problem of, can you even get a patent on some of this stuff, and there's a lot of interesting writing out there about, it essentially boils down to the creativity of the drafter of the claims, because you can avoid or run into what are known as Alice problems depending on how you frame the claim, and sort of Alice is a Supreme Court decision that made it a lot harder to get patents on software or anything really that's implemented by a computer, and it's a very poorly understood, constantly evolving standard. And I think there are examples of blockchain patents being granted, and there are others where the applications have been rejected, and a lot of it comes down to the way the claim is drafted and whether or not it satisfies Alice. The other issue is, once you get a patent, is anybody actually going to be an infringer? And the reason that could be relevant in the blockchain context is this notion of divided infringement, where you have different parties satisfying different elements of a claim, and whether they can be held liable for infringement becomes interesting in the blockchain context, because it's this decentralized network where you have a bunch of people who may or may not know each other, practicing different elements of a claim that would cover the blockchain. And so you may get a patent, but good luck suing anybody, depending on how you've drafted your claims. And so I think it's going to be a while before we see how that shakes out. Some people are anticipating a big smartphone war 2.0 involving blockchain, and other people think it's unlikely. And we'll just have to see what happens.
We will indeed. All right. So just keep your eye out for blockchain-related patents. I have the feeling we are just at the beginning of the floodgates opening on that front. Let's move on to a point on the legislation and policy front before we wrap up the show. There was a leak from Senator Mark Warren's office that was published by Axios that, in case you didn't see it, it is worth checking out. The leaked white paper, it was a draft prepared by the senator's office, is entitled Potential Policy Proposals for Regulation of Social Media and Technology Firms. So as we've been discussing on this show, whether there are things that Congress can or should be doing, this gives some insight into at least how some senatorial staffers are thinking about the issues. And there were 20 different paths laid out in this paper to address some of the concerns that are on Congress's mind, from putting a price on individual users' data, something we've discussed a lot on the show, to funding media literacy programs, to ensuring the authenticity of users on the platforms, et cetera, et cetera. So the paper divides things up into three categories: combating disinformation, protecting user privacy, and promoting competition in the tech space, and gives some various specific proposals that apparently are being considered, including new resources and rules for government, new rules that might be imposed on the various platforms, various penalties they might face if they fail to comply with those rules, et cetera, et cetera. Brian, did you get a chance to take a look at this? And did you see anything in there that resonated with you?
Well, there's a lot in there. I think some of it is familiar with Europe's GDPR. They mentioned that actually in the paper. But it goes a lot further than that, dealing with some of this disinformation. I think we've kind of touched on that already today. with how difficult it can be to regulate this. I think it's right for Congress to be considering these issues and debating these issues, and I'm glad they're doing so. And I'm hopeful that they will continue to debate it and carefully tease out these issues before deciding to move forward with any kind of regulation. I think some of this, again, could have these unintended consequences. How do you determine, how do you regulate what's disinformation versus something you just don't agree with? How do you determine what is a bot account versus just an individual using account and accessing it through some program? There's a lot of issues like that that this kind of touches on, and I think it needs a lot more discussion and consideration.
Yeah, devil's in the details on those kinds of issues. What do you think, Stefan?
I think this has the potential to impact a lot of major companies that are driving innovation in these fields. And I hope that the discussion that happens is public and transparent and takes into account just how improvisational a lot of the developments are. I mean, I don't think people realize how challenging it is to satisfy the different stakeholders in these situations. And I think people on the margins can lose sight of that. And the reality is this isn't all being done according to some master plan. People make decisions and then there are consequences and they react to those consequences. And I would hope that the regulators take that into account when they're confronting these big questions. So there's a lot to balance, and I hope that they take a thoughtful approach that doesn't restrain all the great technology that we've been able to take advantage of over the past few years, thanks to the fact that we've let these guys do their jobs. I'm trying my best to be diplomatic.
Yeah. Again, we should point out that this paper is just a draft and it was not intended for public consumption, and Axios somehow got hold of it and published it. But it's interesting just to give some insight into the thought processes that might go into laws that we see proposed in the future. So if you're interested in technology, law, and policy, it's certainly an interesting document to peruse. We wanted to highlight that for you. Let us move on to our animal selfie of the week. So with resounding unanimity, while I was off on break, many people made sure that I saw this particular video of a dog who had stolen a GoPro and begged that we feature it in our weekly segment on Animal Selfies of the Week, which we love to feature here. Apparently, the rest of the world has caught wind of the fact that when an animal steals a GoPro, it can be highly entertaining. We've known this for quite some time. It can also have several interesting and or sort of funny legal overlays to it. So the delightful thing about this video, I think, is just the way in which the dog's face is captured the entire time, and it's darting little facial expressions as it's wondering if it's going to get caught and deprived of its new toy. The moment on Twitter that featured this, I think it first surfaced on Reddit, speculates or implores Netflix to please make a series out of this right away. So definitely, I'm sure folks' creative juices are churning.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't able to find the one with the sound. So
that's okay. Obviously, most adorable dog producing a most adorable video. This is a true animal selfie where the dog is operating the camera. So if the Naruto case is any indication, PETA would make the argument that the animal has the copyright to this video. The Copyright Office would disagree, since it says that animals cannot have copyrights in anything. And the Ninth Circuit has weighed in on the issue in favor of the Copyright Office position, but God knows what other courts might do with it. So we love to keep an eye not just on these entertaining videos, but on the ramifications, not just of rights of animals, but other things. Oh, do we have the version with other folks' music laid over? Another legal issue, of course, about these kinds of viral videos is there we go. When the internet gets a hold of something like this, it's going to put its own spin on it and add music that might be copyrighted and create its own derivative work that might be copyrightable in its own right. So that certainly seems to have happened with this particular video. The other thing that strikes me as interesting is, if you were going to develop a Netflix or other series featuring this particular dog and or its cohorts, you're getting into not just the copyright of the animal, but its rights of publicity and et cetera, et cetera. So, Stefan, any thoughts?
I noticed when the dog is running, it runs by a number of buildings, and there's a case pending right now in the Central District of California. There's going to be a summary judgment hearing at the end of August, and the case is going to decide whether photographs of graffiti taken on out in public, whether the graffiti artist has a right to prevent those photographs from being distributed on copyright grounds, or whether that graffiti is just a part of the protection that the building enjoys and the exemption to photographs there. So you could wonder if there was some graffiti on one of these buildings and the dog runs by it, and that graffiti enjoys independent protection separate from the exemption enjoyed by the building. Could the dog be an infringer for having photographed the graffiti and distributed it online? And so that's right.
that copyrights
down
cut
the rabbit
ways,
hole,
don't they?
Yeah. So if PETA wants to say that dog gets to have a right in the image it's taken, maybe the dog can be an infringer too. And I personally would love to sue that dog and just to see how it holds up under cross-examination. But maybe I'm not a dog person. So.
I don't think that's going to be a popular stance to take, that you want to be the lawyer hauling the dog into court. What do you think, Brian?
On behalf of a graffiti artist, I think that'll get a lot of press.
Yes, indeed. You could top Naruto on that one. Brian, any thoughts?
Well, I'm glad the law has played out the way it has, so that we can play videos like that and not worry about being sued, at least at the moment. Because otherwise we would all be missing out on the enjoyment of that video and then editing it and adding our own twist to it. Certainly one of my favorite videos I've seen recently. And I wouldn't want to be the one suing that dog for any sort of copyright infringement.
Yeah, definite jury appeal that dog has. Let's see. Our tip of the week, again, this was all over everywhere this week. So you've probably seen that perhaps if you're looking, you or maybe your youngster is looking for a good way to make some spare cash, you or they might be able to land themselves a position as someone's Fortnite coach. Interested. There's actually a great take on this from Ben Kuchera over at Polygon, who writes, "Let's all calm down about professional Fortnite coaching." He says the complaints seem to there was a lot of outrage and consternation, and even I posted a snarky comment that if you're working as a Fortnite coach, then you are the new definition of knowledge worker. But he says their complaints seem to boil down to paying someone to teach your kids how to play a video game is bad, because of course it is. And he goes through and presents some compelling arguments why, you know what, you need to just get over the fact that people are capitalizing on this hugely popular video game and spending more time with their families in the process. It's not just apparently the kids that are getting coached, but also the parents in some instances. So, it's not the end of the world. The sky is not falling because some people are getting paid to coach others in the art of video gameplay. Any thoughts, Brian?
I think that was really smart of the people who first became Fortnite coaches. I mean, I applaud their entrepreneurship there and deciding there was money to be made. I don't see anything wrong with it. I mean, I can't imagine personally spending money on a video game coach, but I don't fault those who do.
Right. My kid in particular, well, I'm trying to encourage him to make a few bucks on this, and so far I haven't been able to light a fire under him, but he wonders how much Ninja would get paid for his consulting services, and whether he might just stream the whole process and make even more money off the ads and make anybody instantly famous that he was coaching. So certainly you could have celebrity Fortnite coaches as well. Maybe we should keep an eye out for that. Stefan, any thoughts?
All I can say is about 15 years ago, a friend of mine took her cat to a cat therapist, and that set a bar for me, and nothing could be more absurd than that. So power to the Fortnite coaches. I think you're making the best of your role in this late capitalist system we live in, and I encourage you to, to bleed those parents dry if you can. And
yeah, I've seen this described as a sign of the apocalypse. I think it's maybe more accurately described as this week's most telling tip that we're living in a simulation. But as someone who lives in Southern California, I can tell you that cat therapy, dog therapy, pet therapy is definitely still a thing.
And it's great. I encourage everybody to do whatever they can to get joy out of their lives and money from other people, as long as it's ethical and safe.
Excellent advice.
Yeah.
What else? We have a couple of resources of the week. Actually, one resource of the week and one bleg, since we've been throwing it back to the old world of blogging and ethos and community practices. One of the things long hailed in the blogging world was the bleg, which was going on your blog and requesting help with something. We have put in our discussion points for this week a way that you can help us out here at This Week in Law, and a way that you can help Stefan and Mike Keys out over at Dorsey and Whitney. They both contribute to a really excellent blog there that is called the TMCA. Remind me what TMCA stands for, Stefan. I always blank on the acronym. Trademark.
Copyright and advertising.
Copyright and advertising. It's a wonderful tech blog. We feature stories from there all the time here on the show, and not just because we are good friends with some of the authors. They really have quality work, and their blog and our show last year were really honored to be included in the American Bar Association's Web 100. They used to do a blog 100, but since, people's uses of the web have evolved over the years, I no longer really blog anymore, but I do the show. They have converted their 100 honorees into people using the web in various ways. So there are blogs, there are podcasts, etc. I don't know if they include like a really good Twitter account or not, but they honor 100 websites that they think are worth recognition and your attention. So both of our sites, both This Week in Law and the TMCA, would love your support. If you think we should have this recognition again this year, you can head on over to abajournal.com/blogs. That's BLAWGS/Web100. And yes, I have to plead guilty to coining that word, that terrible portmanteau word of blog and law, long ago. Anyway, if you go on over to that page, and we'll post it in our discussion points for the show, you can nominate the Dorsey and Whitney Wonderful, the TMCA blog. You can nominate our show. You can say what it is and why you enjoy it, and let them know that you think we should be on their list again. We would appreciate it. It was good fun last year, and it's just a nice thank you for the work that we do in both those places. And then our actual resource of the week came my way from one of our listeners highlighting it and letting me know on Twitter. That's a great way to let us know about things that you're seeing while you're vagabonding around the web. This was a really interesting piece at Motherboard by John Christian there that explains, first of all, this phenomenon where Google Translate, you can put garbage words into Google Translate and get back the most perplexing, sort of religiously overtoned messages. For example, and if you're one of the people who figures out that this kind of thing is possible or is happening, then kudos to you, because it's so interesting to find these little glitches and bugs and things. Someone figured out that if you put the word dog in repeatedly to Google Translate and you ask it to translate from English to Maori or one or the other, you get back this incredibly cryptic translation that says, "Doomsday clock is 3 minutes at 12. We are experiencing characters and a dramatic developments in the world, which indicate that we are increasingly approaching the end times and Jesus' return." Maybe this has something to do with coaching Fortnite. I'm not sure. But anyway, Motherboard took a deep dive into this and say that these strange things are likely happening because of the spooky nature of neural networks, and possibly the fact that Google Translate has a feature, or perhaps a bug, where people can say, "No, here's a better translation of what you've given me," and maybe suggest an edit button. So one way or another, we're getting these bizarre results out of Google Translate. And of course, as soon as the bizarre results were pointed out to the folks at Google, the bizarre results magically went away, but that doesn't mean they weren't there in the first place. And there may be others yet to be discovered. So if you're interested in these strange artifacts in Google Translate, or maybe this, joins also as proof that we're living in a simulation, this is just one of the artifacts along the way. It's worth checking out. So that's our resource of the week. Any thoughts, Steffens?
I suspect there's a leaker. I have to believe somebody at Google went on Reddit and leaked this. No way somebody was playing around and and found that on their own. Yeah. But if that is what happened, yes. It must have been an amazing moment for that person, and I wish I could have been the one to do it, because it's wonderful.
If you're sitting around typing dog into Google Translate several times and just seeing what happens, I don't know. You're a tinkerer of the highest order. Right.
And nobody would believe you, right? I mean, right. You did it, you succeeded, and you go and tell somebody, and they're going to look at you like you're insane. So it's great. I love it, but I don't believe that it came about honestly. I think there was a leaker.
Okay. Brian, what are your thoughts?
It actually illustrates some of the problems that forensic examiners are going to be having in the coming months and years with trying to figure out what's human generated and what's AI generated.
Right.
It's becoming a problem on phones. Like what was done by a human versus what was done by some program running behind the scenes using a neural network or artificial intelligence or whatever's going on behind the scenes. And it's a very difficult problem for forensic examiners to figure out. This is just a funny example of it.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation. Describe how that comes up. When would you ever have to try and determine if something was human generated or machine generated? How would that come up in a case?
So there's an example that I learned from another forensic examiner. There was a message sent from one individual to another, and there was a restraining order in place prohibiting that person from sending a message. And they had to figure out, did that person actually send the message, or was it some AI that sent the message? And through a series of testing with the particular app that was in use, they determined that it was likely sent automatically by an AI and not by the individual. But that was the difference between being convicted of violating a court order or not.
Mm-hmm. Wow, fascinating. And then, not only just that there are various systems put in place to automatically respond when programmed to do so, but at least Gmail is now suggesting responses. You have to select them. But your finger could slip and you could fire back one of the suggested responses without really intending to, I suppose. So yeah, that's a fascinating twist on our resource of the week. What is the state of the art on that, Brian? How do you make the determination?
It's not easy. You first have to suspect that there's something going on in the first place. Otherwise, you would just look at the data and say, oh, there was a message that was being sent. But you have to, in order to kind of tease it out, you basically need to recreate the situation and then test it. We don't have access, generally speaking, to the code that's running behind the scenes. We can see in some contexts, like, for example, people talking to an Echo or a Google Home device, we can see what was said. You can actually play back that audio, and you can see what Google or Amazon's interpretation of that audio was. So there's a pretty obvious example of what was said versus what was heard. But otherwise, it's a matter of recreating and testing to see if you can generate the same results.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So interesting to have you on the show today, Brian. We're really glad we had the opportunity to explore all these issues with you. Other than knowing they can find you at chaseconsulting.com, is there anything else, and bchaseaz on Twitter, is there anything else you'd like to let our audience know about before we sign off for today?
No, you can certainly reach me on Twitter or through my website. I'm not terribly active on Twitter, but I'm on there occasionally, and I'll certainly get messages if someone sends me a message there.
Wonderful. Thanks again so much for joining us. We hope to have you on again sometime.
I'd love to be.
Stefan Spida, so good to see you again. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me again.
So what have you been up to with your summer leisure time, or have you had any since you're involved in litigation and that kind of thing can be few and far between?
I think there was a 5 or 6 week period where every week I had to go traveling for depositions. So that's what I've been doing. It's been the summer of anti-summer. It's been fun though, because, as much as we all like to complain about how much work we have, I like litigating. I like depositions. I like traveling around. It's a bit of a burden when it's 6 weeks in a row, but it's fun and I like it. And so I guess I take some kind of pleasure out of that, but it has not been anything like a traditional summer. So
yeah, well, hopefully they're at least sending you to fun places. Not necessarily. I'm so sorry. I hope you get a break soon. We're really even more appreciative of the fact that you've taken the time to join us today. Thank you so much for being here with us on This Week in Law. It's been really fun.
It's been great. This is my summer vacation. I like this.
Oh, that makes me feel really good. All right. Well, we hope that we've been your break from whatever is going on in your busy lives today. We're really thrilled that you all joined us. We're so excited that you do on and off, in and out every week or when you can. If you go over to twit.tv/TWiL, that's where our whole archive of shows lives. So you can go back into the archives and see, God, they were talking about this in 2006 and it's still going on. Or look what Real Networks was doing in 2006 and what they're doing now. I do enjoy digging back into our archives from time to time and seeing how our discussions and what's been in the news in the area of technology law and policy have developed over time. And of course, you'll find our most current shows there too, as and when they come out, and instructions on how to watch or listen to them on your device of choice and at your leisure. We're so excited that you do watch and listen however you can. If you're an iTunes person, every now and then I like to remind people to go over and leave us a review or a comment there. Same thing if you watch on YouTube, wherever. If you have a moment and you like the show, we love to hear about it. Even if you don't like the show, particularly if you don't like the show, please do let us know why, and we will work toward achieving our best selves just for you. You can also give us those comments in other platforms as well. You can reach me on Twitter. I'm D Howell there. And I'm Denise at twit.tv if you want to reach out via email. Oh, there's one other resource of the week I wanted to throw in for people. I've decided this has a technological overlay purely because of the forensics involved, even though it's a series about a murder trial. People often send me, listeners to this show often send me interesting things that they've stumbled across in various entertainment venues, including, it's so hard to decide what to watch on Netflix now because there's so much there. But there is a series there called The Staircase. Is this something you have seen, Brian?
I have not seen it. I've been told about it. It's on my list of things to watch.
Oh, you should watch. I'm nearly done with the whole thing. It's about a murder trial that happened in North Carolina. The trial itself took place in 2003. The crime itself, well, not crime, loaded term. The death that caused the murder trial happened in 2001, and it involved a woman who fell down her stairs, and her husband was prosecuted for first-degree murder on the theory that he had bludgeoned and pushed her. And the reason I'll throw it in as a recommendation here is, again, people always send me one, so I want to pass one back to our audience that I've thought has been worthwhile to watch. I have a real problem watching legal dramas generally because things go cognitively dissonant when I feel like they're not accurately portraying what happens. But this is a documentary that was done about, no, not a podcast, a documentary where unprecedented, as far as I'm concerned, access to the discussions that the defendant had with his defense team, discussions the prosecutors had in prepping the case and putting on witnesses and things. There must have been some stipulation that none of this would be released until long after all the legal issues had been resolved. But it's easy to watch as a lawyer because it's very accurate. The only thing that's not, rigorously accurate is they had to edit. It was a hugely lengthy trial and they couldn't put everything in. So there are certain gaps where you wonder, I wonder what they did about this. And it's just not in there because it would have been months long instead of just 13-episode series or however many it is. But the technological overlays are all about the forensics in the show. The models that were put together by both sides to decide whether something was a fall or a murder. And also DNA evidence comes into it as well. So again, that's something we touch on the show from time to time. So if you are interested at all in a really gripping story, check out The Staircase on Netflix. And if you like the nitty-gritty details of how a case is put together and tried, it's very much that, and it's a huge human story as well, the people who have to go through the legal process. So just something to pass along, particularly with Brian on the show today. You should check it out, Brian.
I will.
Okay. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today, and we will see you next week on This Week in Law. Until then, take care.